Okay guys, so today we're going to learn about yeast, baker's yeast specifically, how it works, and then we're going to use it by baking bread, which is pretty cool. So the lesson's called Yeast, a Fungus and a Friend, because that's exactly what it is. And it's in the fungus kingdom, so it's a living organism. It exists absolutely everywhere, like between your toes in the air, everywhere. And we use it to bake bread, among other things. So some basic history is that the first time anybody thinks anyone else used yeast to bake bread was in ancient Egypt. They found some giant baking rooms. But for the rest of the world, nobody else really knew how to use yeast or how it worked. And luckily, in 1859, Louis Pasteur actually looked at yeast underneath a microscope. And what he discovered was that yeast is a single-celled reproducing, metabolizing organism, and it's not a chemical compound like other people thought it was before, like baking powder, baking soda is. So that's pretty cool. And 9 years later, in 1868, Fleischmann's Yeast came out, which is a commercial company based out of Cincinnati, and they've been producing yeast for the United States ever since, and that's what we're going to use today. If you look right here, this is how yeast works. Yeast needs a couple things to live, metabolize, and reproduce healthily. It needs moisture, heat, normally between 105 and 115 degrees, and sugar to metabolize, okay? So this is an amateur sketch of yeast underneath a microscope, drawn with dry erase markers. These blobs are yeast, these little brown squares are sugar, and then this is just at a comfortable 110 degrees Fahrenheit. When yeast eats sugar, it has two byproducts, which are alcohol and CO2, which come into play when leavening dough or bread, making it rise. And the way that yeast reproduces is by an asexual process known as budding, where it grows this appendage and then soon after builds a cell wall between that appendage and itself, and that appendage breaks off, grows, and becomes its own yeasty self. So here, if you look, there's the beginning of the appendage. This is another one that's a little farther in the process. This one has the cell wall. Soon after, there'll be two separate yeasts. And that's really cool, but what's even cooler is baking with it. So come over here. Normally when you work with yeast, to start out you put it in a yeast mixture. This is called a proofing process. So you put it in a bowl with warm water, sugar, in this case honey, and yeast, and you let it sit for about 15 minutes. While it's in this process, you can actually observe it breaking down the sugars and producing CO2 and alcohol. You can smell it and you can see the little foamy bubbles. It's not really apparent in a video, but if you were here, you could tell. So once you've made that, which I've prepared it right here, you're going to mix it with the dry ingredients, which in this recipe is only salt and flour. And once you've mixed that together really well, it comes out looking like this. Don't worry, when you first mix it together, it is not so clean and organized and pretty looking. It takes some time, so don't be discouraged. When we do this together after this short lesson, you will see. So once you get it to this point, you knead it for a few minutes, and the purpose of kneading it is actually to help make all of these intricate, like, webs of gluten in the dough. We call it a gluten matrix, and the reason why you do that is to have a mass that will trap the CO2 bubbles that the yeast produce in it, and then that's what makes it rise. And so if you look at like a sourdough loaf that's been baked, or really most bread that's been baked and leavened, if you slice into it, you'll see these little air pockets. So what we're going to do now, you knead it for about a few minutes, and then you let it sit for a half hour to an hour until it doubles in size, and it looks a little bit like this. Huge, right, compared to that one? You can actually see the CO2 pockets in it. It's really cool. So once you bake it, you cook it, the alcohol bakes off, and then you get to eat it, and it's delicious. And now we're all going to do that together.